Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. We're really excited to be a part of this chamber event. Many of you know NBC. We've been around for about 10 years. We're excited to play a small but very critical role of bringing jobs and investments to rural Virginia. All of that was possible because of Virginia Tech, Old Dominion Electric Cooperative, and the Virginia Tobacco Commission. Without those investments and support, we wouldn't have major companies like Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, ICF International, and several other big companies that have come down and currently look in innovating in the region. So really happy to do that. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. J.D. Foster, who is the Deputy Chief Economist at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He works with the Chamber's chief economists, exploring and explaining developments in U.S. and global economies. He also participates in discussions around the country regarding the economy and economic policy, supports other functions at the Chamber with both economic analysis and guidance. He writes extensively on tax policy and entitlement reform, as well as matters on all things regarding monetary policy and international economics. He's joining us today to discuss the national economic outlook and share a very exciting federal policy briefing. So please join me and welcome Dr. J.D. Foster.
Thank you. Thank you all for being with us today. I appreciate it. The U.S. Chamber deals primarily with federal issues and international issues. We partner a lot with state and local chambers. And if you hadn't figured out from the energy and the participation in this meeting, Virginia has a tremendous state chamber. It's very effective, it's engaged, and it's due a lot, obviously, to the business community in Virginia, but especially to the leadership of the Virginia Chamber, Barry Ball and his staff, and they deserve all your support. Yeah. I officiate swim meets a lot, and I have the same problem with microphones there. I don't know, it's me and technology. And because of that problem with technology, I keep my props very simple. This is the U.S. economy. It's pretty full. That's what it should be. If we're any fuller, it'd be sloshing on my hand and probably create other electronic problems. That's where we should be. This is where we are. Now, if you're an optimist, that's glass half full. If you're a pessimist, it's a glass half empty. One thing is undeniable, it's not full. That's the U.S. economy today. It's not terrible. It's not great. It's not where it should be. 3 years ago or so, we should have reached full in our glass of water representing the economy. But 3 years later, we're still not there. And under most projections, we're not going to be there for quite a few years. So what does a glass half full economy look like? Well, first of all, on the plus side, we've had 6 years of growth. If you're not used to these graphs, gray bars generally represent periods of recession. There's a long period there from that last gray bar to where we are today. That's 6 years. That's not bad. That's pretty impressive pattern of growth, about 2.2% a year. Not strong by any measure, but not terrible. And projections for next year, for the most part, are more of the same. That's glass half full. The housing sectors and financial sectors have well recovered. That is also a good sign for the economy, consistent with a glass half full. The economy's created over 11 million jobs. Job report today, 211,000 more jobs created. That's good. Not great, but good. The unemployment rate's down to 5%. That's pretty good. So these top two charts, obviously done before today's jobs report, show the two surveys the government produces. Survey of households, survey of businesses. Both tell pretty much the same story. The gray bar again is a recession. You can see the job growth since recession. Pretty good. Over on the right-hand side, the unemployment rate, 5%. The unemployment rate's not quite as accurate a gauge of labor markets as it used to be because of some dynamics involved, people being out of the workforce and so forth. But however you cut it, 5% is pretty good. And that lower left-hand corner there, initial unemployment claims below 300,000. Normally, if you're below 300,000, you're thinking the economy's grown at 4.5% a year. It's not. But that tells you something interesting going on in the labor markets, consistent with the unemployment rate not really being an accurate gauge of the economy. Household net wealth has well recovered from the recession. It's way up. That's a sign of, we measure too often the economy by GDP. GDP is important, but there are other aspects of the economy that represent how we are doing as a nation economically. Household wealth is part of that. That's done very well. U.S. corporate profits, also done really well. I remember back in the early 2000s watching one of the four-letter television shows, no advertising here, and Larry Kudlow got on and he said in amazement, U.S. corporate profits now exceed $1 trillion. And he was shocked, as was I, at the very concept of U.S. corporate profits exceeding $1 trillion. Well, we're now well over $2 trillion. And that's just for corporations. If you were to look at all businesses, you'd sort of see another chart for non-corporate businesses mirroring that pattern, doing very, very well. And why is that so important? Well, it's not just because corporations are making a lot of money. But if you want corporations to be investing a lot in America's future, and you don't want them taking on a lot of debt to do it, this is where you get the money. So strong corporate profits is essential. Strong business profits is essential to a strong growth that's not based on debt. Not that debt's always bad, but on balance, we would all prefer that they finance investment out of equity. Other points, the non-manufacturing index from Institute of Supply Management. The most recent number is quite a bit lower. I finished these slides before the most recent reports. Now it's around 56. But that's still expensive. The way these indices work is 50 is treading water. Above 50 you're growing, below 50 you're contracting. 59 down to around 56, I think, still pretty good. Inflation is almost non-existent at 0.2%. That's really good. The budget deficit is down below $500 billion. That's good. Let's stop and think about this for a minute. Okay, I'm standing outside, just drove home from work. My neighbor walks up to me with bloodshot eyes and said, "Guess what, Foster? I've cut my consumption of Old Granddad down from 2 bottles a night to 1. How am I supposed to react to that? That's good? You know, I'm not arguing we all have to be teetotalers, right? Don't have to be teetotalers, but something significantly less than a bottle of Old Granddad a night is probably advisable, and it is. Unfortunately, it's going to get worse. Under current law, that's right, current law projections, you see how the budget deficit begins to take off going in the future. That's that top bar. And as a share of GDP, it rises as well. Now, keep in mind, the increase here that's being projected is not because of an explosion of what we normally think of as government spending or a collapse in tax revenue. It's because the interest rates at some point are going to get back to where they ought to be, where they're normal, where the 10-year treasury is around 5.5% or 6%, not 2%. Well, the federal government's issued a lot of debt, and that's going to get real expensive. So your net interest expense is going to jump from a little over $200 billion a year to over $800 billion, and that's the soaring budget deficit. Guess what? That means for the most part, this is already baked in the cake. If nothing else changes in federal policy, this is what is going to happen just because interest rates will eventually normalize in our economy and across the world. And that means, of course, we've got this huge explosion of federal debt rising rapidly. The most important number is, the chart is one below, debt to GDP. It's important to measure debt relative to the size of the thing that has to pay the debt, whether it's a family, a business, or a country. In the post-war era, we've traditionally had debt to GDP below 40%. After we had this big pile of debt at the end of the Second World War, we worked it down, the economy took off, we got below 40%, and that's where we stayed. Then under this president, for a variety of reasons, sometimes contributing by Republicans, sometimes not, but for whatever reason, we shot up above 70%. And it doesn't come down again. That's our new normal. Below 40 to above 70, and then over time it begins to take off. And notice I haven't said anything yet about entitlements. We have all heard about how the entitlement programs are going to explode in cost and become a huge problem. It's all true. Only another four-letter organization disputes that fact. Where does that happen? Well, it happens just outside that window. So what you see here is interest expense rising. And after that window, we see the explosion in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security costs as a share of the budget. So guess what? It gets worse from here. This is, in a sense, the good news. That's glass half full if you're really, really optimistic. And there are multiple local weaknesses in the economy. Wages have been very, very flat for a long time. Now we're starting to see some pickup in wage growth. That's extremely encouraging. Unfortunately, healthcare benefits are rising so rapidly in cost that they're crowding out wage growth. So we don't get a lot of spendable money. We get a lot of healthcare spending. The ISM Manufacturing Index, remember I said below 50 means contracting? Well, this was done before the latest index came out. We're now below 50. The manufacturing sector in the United States, in the aggregate, is contracting. It's sliding into a local recession in manufacturing. That's not good news in any step. And I mentioned inflation being so low. Sounds great if you know it's not going to get lower. But if you slip from inflation to deflation, where prices in the aggregate are falling, you got a real problem. Deflation is probably the scariest word in the economist lexicon. Because at that point, almost nothing we do to try to get an economy to grow faster works. Most especially monetary policy, which doesn't work real well these days, doesn't work at all when you're deflating. So that's a big concern. Another big concern is when the electronics don't work. There we go. And finally, this one sort of sums up the whole story of the glass half full. This is a chart of GDP. The red line is called potential GDP. This proves that economists have no use for language whatsoever because it's not potential. You cannot be 110% of your potential. I don't care what the running back tells you. Now, the blue line is actual GDP. And you'll notice the gray bars again are recessions. Every time we have a recession, the economy snaps back, usually in 18 to 20, 30 months, something like that, 36 months. Every time we snap back. Every once in a while, that blue line gets above red, which is why you can't call the red potential. It's really a measure of where the economy should be. Where should the economy be? Markets are operating normally. Some sectors are doing better than others. Where should we be? That's the red line, the should be line. And every time we get above the should be line, the Fed comes along, gets a little carried away with itself, raises interest rates too far, and usually we have a gray bar thereafter. That's called the recession, triggered by the monetary policy. Okay, that's normal stuff. Recession, we grow, we recover quickly, get a little carried away with ourselves, the Fed takes away the punch bowl, we get back to recession, until we get to the far right side. And here we have the perpetual glass half full. We have the recession, we have the beginnings of recovery, and the lines do not come back together again. Ever, under current projections. That is very strange. Normally, we snap back. In fact, normally when we have a really bad recession, we snap back quickly. It's like a rubber band. If you pull it a little bit, it comes back with a little bit of pace. Really stretch that, and let it go. Your finger's going to hurt. It's going to snap back so fast, right? It didn't happen. We had a deep recession. We did not have the expected recovery that should have occurred very, very quickly, and in fact, the lines don't come together. Worse, this is a downgraded future. That blue line is from the Congressional Budget Office. They're the ones who give the standard estimate of where the economy should be, or potential GDP. The top line there is from the estimate from 2007. Every line below that, succeeding line, is the next year's forecast for that period. And you notice there's a pattern there. It's always coming down. This chart was first put together by Larry Summers and put in the Wall Street Journal. Now, Larry Summers, in case you don't recall, is a former Clinton and Obama administration official, not exactly a member of the Tea Party. All right? This is CBO data. All he did was put it all on one place. And what we see is the length of this recession and then the continuance of underperforming in our economy year after year after year has done real damage to our economic potential. But that's not all that's done the damage, and we'll come back to that. But that's the reason those two lines started to come together, the should line and the where we are line. It's not because the where we are line is growing faster. It's because the should line was pulled down. So, now why is the glass half empty? Is it suddenly that because of the recession, the American worker has become lazy and indolent? Is he not showing up for work? Are they not doing what they're supposed to do? No. American workers are as hardworking and diligent as ever. Nothing wrong with the American workforce. Could use a little retraining, perhaps in some areas, but basically the American workforce is fine. Is it the American business community? Well, I travel around the country talking to businesses, and they're raring to go. They all have an idea, a plan for their business. Some will succeed, some won't. But there's nothing wrong with American business. The panel just before us here demonstrated that. Is there anything wrong with American entrepreneurial spirit? No. America's entrepreneurial as ever. When they see opportunities, they want to go get them. But they don't go get them as often as they used to, because they have what used to be a part-time ally, a part-time neutral. Right now, they got mostly an enemy 150 miles north of here. I don't care how many friendly chats you have with business executives in the Oval Office. Doesn't matter how many photo ops you have. If your policies are anti-growth, you're not going to grow as well. And that's what we have in the current administration. We've had this incredible stimulus, fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, far beyond anything macroeconomists ever contemplated before. And yet the economy performs poorly, primarily, not solely, but primarily because the administration has had an anti-growth agenda. The thing about that tax increase the president insisted upon, higher dividend tax rates, higher capital gains tax rates, higher individual income tax rates, which means small business tax rates. If your economy is hyperventilating, if it's growing too rapidly and you don't want to rely on the Fed to slow it down, the tax increase the president insisted on and got would be excellent medicine to slow the economy down. And that's what happened. It slowed it down directly, and it slowed it down indirectly by sending the signal that the administration just doesn't get it. And keep in mind, this tax increase had nothing to do with deficit reduction. That's what they will say. It's not true. The budget the president just insisted on, the extra spending the president just insisted on in order to agree to a deal dwarfs the revenues raised by the tax hikes he insisted on. It has nothing to do with the budget, has nothing to do with the growth of the economy because it was anti-growth. It was all about ideology. And that pales in comparison to the president's anti-growth regulatory policies. This is just a list of what he's done, insisted on, got through with his fourth branch of government, the regulatory bureaucracy, this year. Huge areas. Now think about regulatory policy. Unlike tax policy, we can all talk about what the tax rate is. We can all know what the corporate tax rate is. If you're not in the bullseye of one of these regulations, you don't know about it. Now, unfortunately, the president has painted bullseyes on a lot of the American business community. And every one of those regulations doesn't just say, this is a new cost. It means it's coming down the pike and your business plans are frozen for a while till you understand what that regulation is going to do to you. And then it finally comes out, you figure out the cost, you adjust, and then you move on. And we can do that. American businesses have been responding and dealing with regulation out of Washington for a long time. That's normal. What's not normal is the profusion of these regulations and the widespread. Over 240 additional regulations, and guess what? This is all just in the last 12 months. Just before Thanksgiving, the president put out a press release saying, we're going to do a lot more regulations before the end of the year, and 144 of them, by their measure, will be economically significant. Okay, the president's only in office for another year. He's got 144 more economically significant regulations, and they wonder why the economy isn't performing well. Simple solution, give us a break. So what can we do? Well, start with emphasizing cost-effective regulation. It's not that all regulation is bad. Sometimes you have to have regulation. If you're going to have an income tax code, you have income tax regulations, right? You're responsible for the liability whether they've got the regulations out or not. Much the same is true throughout the rest of the regulatory apparatus. Infrastructure investment. Hallelujah, we finally got a highway bill moving. Some of the pay-fors were a little dubious, to be kind, but we got a highway bill. Comprehensive tax reform. Tremendously powerful for the economy if you do it right. Do it poorly, of course, it'll be a negative. I don't care how far you bring the rates down. If you do it the wrong way, you're going to hurt the economy. But if you bring rates down in the wise way, without a huge explosion in the budget deficit and with sensible base broadeners, you can do a lot with comprehensive tax reform. Advance the free trade agenda. And I want to pause here because this is one area where the president has been wonderful. And it's especially difficult. Free trade is difficult for all politicians because American people are leery of free trade. They're worried about the disruptive effect of imports and exports, and we all get that. But free trade is tremendously powerful for advancing the economy. Here's a way to think about it. Free trade and moving free trade says we're all going to do better if we all do what we do best. It's as simple as that. It's about doing better by doing what we do best. I got invited to be on the finance committee of my church. I was not invited to be on the choir. Care to guess why? Okay, that's all you need to know about free trade. The president has been great on this, and it's especially hard because he's been bucking most of his party most of the time on this. Senator Kaine, backing the president on TPA, was tremendously important. One of the few people to stand up with the president on a very important issue, and he deserved tremendous credit for that. A lot of other areas we can do. Notice there's one that's missing on the bottom there. Sometimes goes into the letters W-M-E. Sometimes you hear whammy. You ever heard of whammy before? That's Washington's magical elixir. It doesn't exist. There is no magic elixir. It's hard work. We've done a lot of things wrong. We now need to do a lot of things right, and it's hard work. You got to do all of them, one at a time, and they start to improve the economy. Now let's quickly turn to the future. What do we have to worry about? Well, we have an endgame regulatory surge that I mentioned. 144 economically significant regulations before the end of the year. That's going to slow the economy. We're going to have to overcome it somehow, because there's very little that we can do to stop it. We have a very cloudy international picture, and there's too much detail here to run through. But the reason you worry about this is obviously because when our foreign trading partners are doing poorly, we can't export as much. But much more important right now, because of the interconnectedness of the global financial system, much more important is the fact that the financial system itself, which is not exactly stable right now, is going to get a lot rockier if a lot of these countries that have a lot of debt start getting into real economic trouble and can't pay the debt. So we have problems in Europe, we have problems in Latin America, we have problems in Asia. Nobody really knows what's happening with China. Japan is contracting, Brazil's in depression, Russia is in depression. These are not good signs for our economy, let alone the global economy. And finally, let's take a quick look at monetary policy, because every time you turn on one of the financial channels, this is all they want to talk about. Is the Fed going to raise interest rates anytime soon? Well, maybe. But let's not think so much about what they will do in terms of when they will raise interest rates, but think about more what it will mean to the American economy. Because if you watch the financial channels, they're financial channels, right? They're mostly concerned about what's going to happen in Wall Street and the banking system and insurance companies, not so much the rest of us. And of course, then, if the Fed begins to raise the federal funds rate, what's going to happen? Well, there'll be all kinds of twitterpation in the financial markets. And it will be reported breathlessly on the news channels. It doesn't necessarily mean a lot to the rest of us. Here's the Fed funds rate chart. You can see we've been down here effectively at zero for quite some time. And it's going to start to rise. Not a forecast. Emphasize those words up there. This is just to give you a sense of it. At some point, the Fed will begin to normalize the funds rate, begin to increase it at a very slow and measured pace. That's almost more important, or probably is more important, than the point at which they begin to increase it. How rapidly will they increase it? Suppose they increase the funds rate by a quarter point every 3 months. All right? That means if you do your math, about 2018, start of 2018, we will be at a normal federal funds rate. For that entire period, from today to 2018, we will have an accommodative monetary policy. We will have a stimulative monetary policy. It doesn't become contractionary. It doesn't start to become a brake on the economy until you get above that normal 2.25% range. So for all this period, when everyone's all worried about what raising the funds rate will do to the economy, the Fed is only reducing the amount of support they're giving the economy. They're taking the foot off the accelerator, not putting their foot on the brake. Not for a long time. And Chairman Yellen has been very clear, we're not putting our foot on the brake anytime soon. But all that said, what really would this mean to the economy? And this is where the big question mark comes in. And I'm not going to tell you what it means, because nobody knows. And that's the point to emphasize. Nobody really knows. This is the current interest rate structure. Federal funds rate, 1 year, 5 year, 10 year. As you would expect, as maturities go out, the interest rate gets higher. This is a snapshot of today. And if the Fed starts raising interest rates, just more or less expect the whole structure to rise. Get up to 2%, the whole structure rises. The lower line is where we are, the upper line is where we... That's sort of what we intuit. That's what the textbook tells us should happen. Well, will it? When we were in a similar situation in the mid-2000s. The Fed had reduced interest rates because of a recession, and then they started to raise them. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Chairman Greenspan, in testifying before, I believe it was the Senate Banking Committee, said, there's a conundrum here. I'm raising the short-term interest rate, and the 10-year Treasury is not noticing, and neither is any other interest rate in the real economy. If you look over on the left-hand side, you get what you expect. Funds rate comes down, 10-year Treasury comes down. Funds rate goes up, 10-year Treasury goes up. They kind of move in tandem. And then there's a breakdown in the relationship. The funds rate is brought down dramatically to try to stimulate the economy in the mid-2000s. The funds rate goes back up, and the 10-year Treasury doesn't pay any attention at all. That's a conundrum. It's not supposed to work that way. Now, go back to what we expect funds rate to do. We expect the funds rate to rise at some point and then level off. And we expect, our intuition would say, prior to the conundrum, that the 10-year Treasury and all other interest rates, business interest rates, consumer credit, auto loans, everything else, the whole structure would rise with it. But what if this happens instead, as happened last time? What if the rest of the interest rate structure doesn't pay any attention at all? Global interest rates, not just in the United States, but globally, of all creditworthy countries, shall we say, are extremely low. In Germany, the 10-year Bund is right now at about 0.58, I think. Okay. Inflation in Germany exceeds that, which means if you buy a German Bund, the equivalent of a treasury bond, you are losing money on day one, and you know it, and you're buying it anyway. Interest rates globally are extremely low, and they're held down for a variety of reasons, and this is not new. This has been going on for quite some time. So, when the Fed begins to raise interest rates, does our intuition bear out and the whole structure rise? Or does the Fed raise interest rates and we have the Yellen conundrum, echoing the Bernanke conundrum? Nobody knows. What you will hear a lot of in the financial reporting and on the financial news is very strong opinions, a lot of confidence. And everyone who expresses a lot of confidence about what is going to happen is basically not telling you the straight story. It's theater. So, bottom line, the glass is half full. It's still half full. And in my opinion, the blame for that rests primarily with the administration. I don't see a recession in the near term. There's nothing in the forces against us, foreign or monetary, that should knock us down. And what do we need to do better? Well, defensively, just need government to do less harm, particularly in the regulatory area. Let us catch our breath. Businesses can deal with regulations, but not when they come too much at a time. It's like medicine. If you take too much medicine, no matter how good the medicine is, it's going to make you sick. And proactively, what can we do? Same list. Hard work. Congress is going to have to do it. They're going to have to require leadership from an administration. But this is how we do better. If we do these things, we will, in fact, get back to my glass half fully full. Thank you.